back to another edition of Purple Points. I have an amazing guest today, someone who I'm very excited to have aboard. She is affectionately known as the Red Clay Scholar. She is the founder and host of Outcasted Conversations. You probably already know who it is, but I'm going to tell you anyway. It is Dr. Regina Bradley. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. And I should say, joining the faculty of Armstrong University as well. So, things are good for the Red Clay Scholar, if I must say so.
Oh, yeah. I'm having the best 2015 ever. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Me too. Me too. And I might mention that her book will be hitting the shelves soon, chronicling Stankonia. I know it's under contract. Is there any hint of when we might get a chance to look at those pages?
I mean, I'm letting it simmer a little bit. I still got a little bit of time to work on it, but yeah, be on the lookout for it. It's a game changer. At least I'm claiming it to be a game changer.
Okay, put it out there, and so shall it be, right?
Right.
Okay, so first question I typically ask is, when you hear the color purple, what immediately comes to mind when you think about that?
The movie. That was my first introduction. Full disclosure, I didn't read the novel until my junior year of college at Albany State. Shout out to Albany State University. So I mean, like, it was the film. That was my first time actually watching it. I remember getting with cousins and play cousins. It was like a reunion barbecue, something like that, and we like snuck upstairs to watch The Color Purple. And then not really getting in trouble for it, not really understanding the significance of it as a Southern Black woman narrative at the time, but just being able to, be able to do the one-liners and try to understand what it was that Alice Walker was trying to do. And I really didn't get a really good appreciation for it until I actually read the book. Be like, oh, so this is what, they're trying to get through there. So yeah, that was my first time being exposed, and of course, seeing friends and using those one-liners, and there's always something you can use the color purple for. So I just thought that was a really great way to kind of think about it.
Yeah, indeed. It's a film that cultural icon status for many folk, and
Right.
I can remember too a lot of those one-liners. Even the look, the hand.
So you do right by me.
Got to get the hand up, right? So one of the questions I'm interested in is, there's conversation about the color purple and spirituality, and some scholars are suggesting that the film challenges sort of patriarchal ways of identifying religion. And there seems to be this message of spirituality being connected to finding your voice, finding yourself. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things I really can appreciate now about what Alice Walker was trying to do, especially in the South, you know what I'm saying? One of the things that folks have to understand is religion is like breathing air in the South, you know what I mean? Especially this particular type of religion, more specifically Baptist, Christian, Black Jesus on your shelf type, type of religion. And one of the things I really can appreciate what Alice Walker was trying to do in The Color Purple, and a lot of her other novels also, you know what I mean, is really play around with this idea of deconstructing what religion means as it compares to spirituality, and that there's a difference. I mean, I have this type of conversation with my grandmother all the time. It's like, I'm not necessarily, I'm religious, but I'm also spiritual, meaning that there's a different type of connection there that can't necessarily be put into words. And she plays around with that in The Color Purple a lot, right? This idea that what if the spiritual force or God was a woman? What would that look like? What is it about, why do people suffer, especially Black folks? Why do Black folks suffer? Of course, the really big scene that makes me cry thug tears all the time is when she comes back and God's trying to tell you something. It's like, what is it about this construction of God as male, about this idea of masculinity in the South that she's trying to work through and really kind of push back against? Because normally when we talk about the South, we often automatically go to male narratives, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, right? With the exception of folks like Zora Neale Hurston, and we're having this conversation in the South, and a one-sided conversation, not necessarily patriarchal, but a one-sided conversation about, okay, this is what it means to be Southern, but this is Southernness as it means for Black men. What about Black women? Where do Black women fit into that conversation? A lot of the critiques that I've heard about The Color Purple is the idea that they say that Celie is kept in this kind of like abusive, if we're going to talk about Black women, we have to include this domestic abuse, that she really doesn't have a hold of herself. The resurrection narrative is really, really big, right? And do we have to, how do we speak to ideas of Black women's pain, Black women's trauma, both as it relates to Black men, but also as it relates to the development of themselves, the pushback against what it means for them to be in conversation with themselves, in conversation with each other. The idea that what does it mean to love somebody through something, love in terms of not necessarily an agape type of love, which is what you get with Christianity, but also, romantic love. Where does romantic love fit into this conversation about spirituality? I just really think there's multiple layers of what spirituality means. One is also a resurrection of self, resurrection of community, the idea that in order for us to have a spiritual conversation, we have to have Black women in that conversation, especially in the South. Yeah, and I'm like just thinking through what that construct means, what redemption means, right? What forgiveness means. All of these kind of principles that are associated with Black Christianic theology and thought, and how they actually manifest in real time, and especially in the South, which is often considered to be for Black folks this dense and unforgiving space.
Absolutely. And I think, you raise a really interesting point in that she plays around with these ideas throughout the narrative, whether we're talking about the film or the novel, although we could argue there's some input of Spielberg, but I think a lot of her ideas still come through, whatever Hollywood is doing in terms of production of Black film in the 1980s. So there's this really interesting thing that I think happens, and there's the texture that we see in the South when it comes through, the voice of Black women. And so one of the things that really strikes me about The Color Purple and its 30th anniversary is how relevant these messages are in the context of Black Lives Matter. Yes. One of the things that people have been talking about is that we think of Black Lives Matter, initially it's about, the lives of Black men. And it shouldn't be a competition, competition for oppression. But how do you have this conversation that is inclusive of the entire Black community, Black women, transgender folk, everybody? And so what's interesting, and I want to get your take on it, is how do you see this film engaging in that narrative in terms of Black Lives Matter? What do you think it offers for us to think about in the ways that we think about Black identity and organizing around the relevancy of Black lives?
Two things. One, it created space. Important. The second part of that, I think, also is for usefully flawed Black folks, right? One of the things that I talk to my students about when we have these conversations about Black Lives Matter during the units that we have in my class is that when we often are first introduced to somebody who's been a victim of this violence and institutional racism, et cetera, we have this vetting process. Can we grieve for them? Are they respectable enough to grieve? Are they acceptable for us to be publicly outraged in ways that warrant the type of protests that we're seeing, across the country right now? And what Color Purple does for me is allows that possibility that you can be a flawed character and still have agency and still be relevant and still matter, which is ultimately what I would, if I was using this in the class to have that type of conversation, that would be my leadway into the novel, which would be, we're having this conversation, and even in the movie, is that you have these useful, beautifully flawed characters that don't have it all together, but yet we still need to acknowledge and respect the humanity that they're presenting, right? And also the idea that all suffering is not the same. I mean, like what Celie was dealing with was kind of like this internal, since she, kind of Pecola Breedlove type, what I'm saying? You saw Pecola Breedlove type strife and concern, and then you have Suge Avery, who's dealing with, she has a very strong sense of self, but in the film she's dealing with being rejected from her father. And then you have Mista, and then you have Sophia, who also is a strong Black woman who's trying to deal with institutional and also public representations of racism that are literally affecting her body, right? Like, I mean, like, she would not look people in the face after she was jailed, and then she worked as the maid. I mean, like, there's multiple ways to think about what suffering means for Black folks, and also multiple ways to approach and complicate it, which is seen in the film in very beautiful and often subtle ways. So it's kind of like, how do we make Black Lives Matter, like, you know, colored purple spaces for everybody in this contemporary moment, while not taking away from what made them significant enough for us to recognize and affirm in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if we're having two conversations. And I think you raised this eloquently, that we're interested in the relevancy of Black lives, but then there's also this vetting process, as you say, like who matters enough and who is towing the line of respectability politics for us to say, yeah, we can ride with this person. As if the fact that you breathe, you have blood flowing through your veins is not enough. So there's this whole notion that you have to be identifiable. So it's like, you know, Claudette Colvin all over again in the 21st century. So one of the things I'm really interested in is, in a lot of your work, you talk about the New South. So I'm wondering if you see any parallels with your notion of the New South with what's going on in the time period of the color purple. And that could be anything, you know, in terms of the experiences that people are having, how they relate to the South, what the South has to say in terms of its geography in reference to this overarching thing of just what's happening with Black people in terms of movement, engagement, politics, social, and otherwise. So if you could tease that out, I'd really be interested in hearing how you see that.
Yeah, one of the things I'm working on in my work is even theorizing as the hip hop South, this idea that hip hop allows us to update the narratives. One of the things I recognize and accept is the fact that the South is cyclical in how it presents its ideas of race and identity, right? Like the idea that something just doesn't happen one time and then we don't revisit it. We're always revisiting the past, right? You have the plantation tours, you have folks, you know, reenacting the Civil War. It's a generational thing. Like, using myself as an example, I remember coming up and it was like my grandparents were always telling me education is an opportunity and don't take it for granted. And, you know, we marched and we protested for you to have these opportunities. And it's bringing itself back up because now you're having similar conversations with these younger protesters who are not using the blueprint that was in place during the 1950s, the 1960s. And folks are uncomfortable with that, right? The idea that not just Southernness, but contemporary Black folks make folks uncomfortable because they're taking things into their own hands, right? And that strife, that tension that is being presented because you're using these blueprints and these models that aren't necessarily considered to be legit or vetted ways of protest for Black folks. And I really like the fact that the South is being reintroduced as a space of Black protest, but according to more contemporary, not necessarily barriers, but more contemporary means of articulating what that means. The idea that we're not forgetting about the civil rights movement, but we're also recognizing the fact that there are shortcomings, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, in The Color Purple, there is a similar line of analysis with what Walker is doing. Yeah, we're talking, I mean, like, it's based in the end of it's immediately after Reconstruction, right? And when we first introduced Cecilia, it's the early 1900s. And it's like, okay, so we're still dealing with that immediate aftermath of Reconstruction. We're dealing with that immediate aftermath of simply what does it mean to be a human being and Black in the US? Where now it's like, what does it mean to be Black, a human being in the US, when we're being told that that really doesn't matter because everybody is human and post-racial, etc. You know, how do we push back against that? So what I'm really interested in is the creative process that is associated with this idea of Black protest rhetoric in Southern spaces, because it really hasn't gone anywhere. It's just simply changed form, but also making room to speak to what that kind of protest means. And the South is the birthplace for that. We're still the birthplace for that. I mean, like, when we think about the protests that are really starting to pop off, of course, you had Oscar Grant in 2009, but it was Trayvon Martin in 2012 that really opened up this conversation about protest, social media, and digital spaces. What does that mean, right? Southernness as a digital space. Trayvon Martin died in Florida. He was from Florida. Florida, whether they like it or not, is a part of the South. And how his death and how that made an imprint for newer generations of not just young Black Americans, but also young Southern Black Americans. I mean, shout out to the Dream Defenders. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Who are using these tragedies to make room to make their voices known by dabbling a little bit in past protests and making room for their own.
And in, you know, in some respects, that's how it should be. You know, you laid yours out, you did your thing. Now it's our turn. And I think, you know, that's something that's definitely Southern, definitely hip hop. So I'm with you in that. I think that there should be an uncomfortable space. You know, there's not like there's a rule book and we're going to follow the same rule book that we had 30, 40 years ago. You know, because there are some people who are probably saying, you know, if this is what we got with that book, maybe we need a new book. We can do something different. So
you mix it a little bit. You know, it's not even a book no more. It's hashtags. It's tweets. You know what I'm saying? The book ain't a physical. You know what I mean? It's no longer. It's not just church meetings. It's not just. I mean, like it's literally memeified, memes and hashtags and tweets and vines and I mean, like, you know, literally recording. Right. I mean, like Mark Anthony Neal had this really dope conversation. He was like, what if the Greensboro Four had Twitter? Right. Like, I mean, like we joke about it, but it's like, you know, what would those tweets look like? This is day 6. I'm out here getting my ass whooped again. You know what I'm saying? Like, what would the hashtag be? You know what I'm saying? You know, what would it mean if you had like somebody live tweeting the debates between Malcolm X and all, you know, Bayard Rustin? Like, what would that be? What would that look like?
I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I'll be like, what would that look like? What if Celie and Suge had Twitter? You know what I'm saying? Like when Suge went on her tours, what would that look like? You know what I mean? Like, I miss you. You know what I'm saying? Send a little meme or something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, so you got Pascal's Restaurant, the heyday of some of those meetings. Yeah. So King has Twitter, Shirley Chisholm and a couple of others. You know, what are they saying? So listen, if we bring in Bayard, what does this look like? Well, Malcolm is going to Selma. So, you know, I wonder these things too. That's a good question. And, you know, how, not only what's their level of engagement with each other, but what is our engagement, people who may not be inside those, you know, intimate conversations? Like, how do we respond to that? So I get a tweet and I'm, you know, hearing about the, you know, Little Rock 9. Right. And it's like, okay, are you participating? You showing up for school? What you going to do? You know, what does that look like? Those are some really good questions.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you know, and again, using creativity to play with that, right? And accepting the fact that protest is messy. Like, that's the one thing I really loved about The Color Purple, was that it was messy. I mean, like, it was Suge's mess, it was Celie's mess, it was Mister's mess, just messy, messy, messy. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, like, making it accessible, you know what I'm saying? And it's not just like this ground concrete definition of this is what it means to protest. This is what it means for you to push back. It's like a sponge, you know what I'm saying? Like, you might be able to get over here and get one thing out of this conversation, and then you might be able to get something completely different. The idea that, it's something else that I was thinking about too, is the correspondence between Nettie and Celie. Right? Like, again, what if that was Twitter? Or what if that was email, right? When they come back and then you have like this really touching moment, again, you know, sweaty eyes, you know what I'm saying? And what would that look like, right? This idea of global Southernness, you know, contemporary American Southernness, Pan-Africanism. I mean, like, she touches on all of these things with this very subtle reunion of a family after, like, what was it, like 30, 40 years, something like that?
Yes.
You know, bringing back this conversation about what does global Blackness look like? What does diasporic Blackness look like? And how does that transcribe across generations? How does that transcribe across mediums? I mean, because in the book, you have a lot more in-depth. I mean, like, you can read for yourself what Nettie is saying in the book. Like, I mean, like, there are pages of letters and she is outlining, you know, this kind of transformation that she's having. And then on the film, you know, you get to see a visual representation of some of the letters that she's writing. And then to have Nettie played by, for real, African royalty, like she was really a princess. You know what I'm saying? Like it's really fascinating, the multiple layers of Blackness as associated with the medium itself, but also, you know, like this idea of the epistolary form. What does that mean now as compared to, you know, the era when Celia and them were engaging in it?
And then, you know, the thing that I think of, this idea of Afrofuturism, you know, in terms of the color purple and the way you have these intersections of, you know, political ideology, because you could argue that there's very much a political ideology that exists in that particular space in the South. You have, you know, these entrepreneurs with the juke joint, you know, and they're talking about, you know, hey, we're going to make some money. We're going to have some place to, you know, do our thing and, you know, have a little moonshine in the process. And I think that sometimes, and again, you know, sometimes for me, my reference point is hip hop, but I think one of the pieces that gets overlooked is, you know, the entrepreneurial spirit that exists in Southern spaces with regard to creating your own. So it's like, okay, I don't need to be signed to a major. I can do this myself.
Right.
I know somebody who has a studio. I know somebody who can shoot. I know where I can get a camera. If I don't know, I can learn. And out of that sort of necessity, you create these spaces for development. And, you know, even though most people might identify this notion of political engagement with, you know, this esoteric rhetoric, at the end of the day, you can have these grand ideas, but how you gonna pay for stuff? How you gonna move on your ideas? And I think that a lot of the spaces that we think of in the South, sometimes they don't include the innovation and sort of the economic impetus of, hey, this is how I'm gonna move on this particular idea, which is something that, you know, say what you want to about Master P, but just in terms of economic genius, I mean, the brother was doing big things. So, but anyway, going back to the color purple, one of the things that I think is interesting too is just this conversation that exists between Celie, her sister, Suge, basically the core female cast members, that they're all, like you said, it's messy and everybody's sort of dealing with their own thing. And I'm not saying that they're going to go out and, you know, chill, hang out on the weekend, but they have this connection that toward the end of the film, you know, at least as I watched it again as a kid, I was just like, man, there's a lot of Black people. I don't think I've seen this in a while. So you see this connection in terms of like this almost unspoken identification with, you know, we're all going through something, whatever it is. And in some instances, thinking of Suge, Celie, and why do I always forget Oprah's character's name? She's like one of my favorite characters, Sophia. You see there's like this bond, and it's really powerful. And I think that says something about the nature of the bonds between Black women and just the way, like, here's my thought. I think that there's this idea of the strong Black woman, and then there's this myth around it. But I think sometimes what gets overlooked is what we see in the color purple, that, like you said, these women, the stuff they're going through is messy. And they defy this myth in that they support, they love, they battle. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this strong Black woman myth. I'm not saying that Black women are not strong, but there is this sort of idea that there isn't a need for support. And whatever your troubles are, just place them at the altar of the strong Black woman and everything's all good.
Yeah, I think it's a little too convenient to kind of jump to, oh, Black women strong, that's what we do. I mean, strength is killing us, you know what I mean? Like mental, you know, these ideas that, you know, dealing with mental health, dealing with physical and emotional health. I mean, like Black women caretakers have a significantly higher rate of getting sick themselves or dying because they're taking care of everybody else. Yeah, and definitely, you know, thinking about this overlap between strength and survival. You know what I'm saying? The idea that, you know, at one point in time, you had to do it all compared to, you know, what does that mean? This idea that, especially in the South, like this is something that I think about in my own upbringing, is that it really does take a village, but it's often a village of women folk. I can tell you I can count on fingers how many play aunts I have, because they were like, we want to have a hand in, you know, how we rear you, not only as a child, but also as a woman. You know what I mean? But really kind of just acknowledging the fact that, you know, strength is complicated. It's not this one-time formula that works, because what you needed strength for in the 1900s is different than what you need strength for in the 2000s. And we don't even know what strength is going to be like 20, 30, 40 years from now, right? Going back to this conversation about Black Lives Mattering, you know, if it's not a blanket term, right? Because what do transgender women need for strength as compared to cisgender women? You know, and acknowledging the fact that there are different sets of circumstances that dictate what that strength looks like. I think that Alice Walker does a really great job of subtly showing what those variances of strength are, whether, you know, staying in this relationship and trying to find yourself, which is what Celie does, whether it's using music and blues. You know, Suge as a blues woman is so significant to the film.
Absolutely.
It's creating, it's carving out creative space to articulate these angst and concerns about being a Southern Black woman, but it's also making room for other women to engage in this kind of like space. You're talking about the juke joint earlier. I mean, like, you know, it's not just a place where, you know, sinning folk go and then go to church on Sunday, right? It's literally a place to vent, to release, to decompress, drink a little something. Have you ever had moonshine? It'll put you on your ass. I'm sorry. I mean, if it's done right, right? You know, finding scapegoats, finding self-care, right? Like, I think ultimately one of the kernels of wisdom that Alice Walker is trying to share are the various ways to self-care for Black women, whether it's music, whether it's letter writing, whether it's reading letters, whether it's, you know, just getting together around the dinner table. The kitchen table rhetoric is well known in Black feminist rhetoric, as well as, you know, just women's, just Black women's lore in general. I mean, like, one of the places I feel most revitalized is when I'm literally sitting around the kitchen table with my mother, my grandmother, and my aunts. I could be having the worst day ever, and then just hearing them laugh and hearing them talk about why, you know, this person ain't shit and that person needs to do better, and you need to get your life. I mean, like, it just does something to the spirit, right? The connection between, going back to your conversation about religion and spirituality, you know, strength as a form of spiritual gifts that Black women share is extremely important. And Alice Walker does a really great job of doing that, both in the novel and also more so in the novel than in the film. You know what I mean? Like, because, you know, in the novel you have more room to play around with, whereas in the visual depiction you have to, like you were saying, Steven Spielberg probably has something to say about it. And I think she didn't stay through the whole filming of the film. I think she dropped out towards the end. But, you know, making room, right? I think ultimately what Strength for Black Women does is makes room to have these conversations about self-care.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about the film. Obviously, as a child, the first time I saw it, the thing that fascinated me the most wasn't actually the film, but it was who was going to watch the film. So I mentioned this before in other interviews, but my mother and I saw it 4 times at least at the theater. Wow. So this is, you know, before the days of the internet and, you know, getting a bootleg DVD. So we went 4 times, and each time we went, it was with a different group of her friends. And then afterwards, the conversations were the crying, the cussing, the laughter. And so even though I didn't really understand what was going on, I could feel the significance of, you know, this circle of Black women and what this movie meant to them in terms of being able to see something that reminded them of who they are. Because, you know, my mother was in the theater, and one of her biggest criticisms of a lot of film and, you know, theater is, you know, I don't see myself.
Yeah.
I never see myself. And so one of the things that they were talking about, and I wanted to get your take on this, is sort of the pushback against the film, that it demonized Black men and it was propaganda. And one of the things that they were saying is, you know, it's interesting that there's always an either or. Either we down for us as a people, or we tend to what we need. And we can't have one without the other. And it's as if we have to have this conversation about how, yeah, we're down, we're with the cause, but it means to sacrifice who we are. So can we fully be present when we're not getting our needs met to participate in that particular struggle? So that was a conversation that they were having back in the 80s. And it's ironic that, even today, there are people, men mostly, who are still engaged in this question of, is this a viable outlet? Do we need to expend our energy on womanism, on feminism, when the real focus is, over here in the political realm, not realizing that all of this is political and all of it is relevant. So if you could just speak to the level of pushback and then how you see that working in contemporary times.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think ultimately what the film does is create space for Black history, because he infamous me, right? Which is, I think, it's still pretty relevant. Like, till you do right by me, you know what I mean? We have to acknowledge the fact that Black women are ultimately at the forefront of these struggles that we're having, and to be continuously pushed to the side in favor of this so-called community rebuilding is problematic, because Black women are part of the community, if not the building blocks for the community. Right. So how can you ignore the foundation and expect the structure to stand? I don't quite understand that, and not taking anything away from the agency and the need to address Black men's issues, but also making room to address Black women's issues, whether people want to believe that or not, is a feminist construct, especially a Black feminist construct. And I think that, when we talk about these conversations about, you were saying, the race to be oppressed, who has more oppression, is problematic in itself, because, we have these conversations about we need to rebuild, etc. But Black women deal with issues and concerns that differ from Black men. Let's be real. And if we don't acknowledge that in favor of, okay, we're going to take care of all these other concerns and then see what happens, that just makes the problem worse, and it develops, right? Because then you're talking about generation, then you're talking about it's kind of like these keepsakes, like you're repeating these keepsakes generationally, economically, expecting a different outcome, and you're not going to get a different outcome because we're not confronting the fact that gender bias does play a significant role in how we address, these political, social, and cultural concerns. And I think that, it's a creative space. Of course, you're going to exaggerate what Mister's character represents in terms of patriarchy and dismantling patriarchy. And in the book, I mean, like, it seemed like it was a pretty gentle dismantling of patriarchy for Mister, because he doesn't have this kind of physical, domestically violent change in ways that Celie does. You know what I'm saying? He kind of just ends up, kind of like this general, like, aha moment, if you will, in the novel, where they ultimately end up being somewhat of friends and knitting pants. Like, I remember them in the novel, like they were knitting pants, right? And that's like, okay, so that's how that's how you kind of get rid of it. Where in the film, you see Celie and her daughter Olivia doing, the me and you will never part clapping game, and you see Mister coming by, pulling a horse or a mule. I mean, like, if it's a mule, that's so Zora Neale Hurston. You know what I'm saying? This idea that Black women are the mules of the world. This is what your grandma said, and their eyes were watching God. It's like, if you want to take the route that it was a mule instead of a horse, you know what I'm saying? That was really gangster in terms of, we need to address the mules of the world. We need to address Black women's concerns.
Right.
Using creative license to do that, because ultimately I don't think that Mister was demonized, because I mean, he had a chance to redeem himself in ways that other folks don't, right? I mean, like, if you demonize something, you don't give them a chance for redemption. Like, I don't see that. True. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Yeah.
And then, as you were talking, I was thinking about his relationship with his father. You don't get to see those kinds of levels to his story if, it is complete demonization. I think a conversation that we're uncomfortable with, at least from the literature I've been reading at the time of the film's release, is this vulnerability. What it means for Black men to admit, I'm flawed, I love, I hurt, I cry. And so you see a cyclical pattern. You got Harpo, Mister, and his father, and you see the way his father sort of beats down on him in his spirit, and then how he deals with that in his own life with his own son. And so there's this lack of compassion and love and opening and vulnerability. And so it's kind of like he doesn't have that with his father. He doesn't have it with his son. His relationships are essentially failed relationships if we're looking at happiness, wholeness, togetherness, all that stuff. And if we take a moment to process that rather than say, oh, it's demonizing black men, and I get that. There are so few images of us. The ones that we do have are sacred and they have to be all things to everybody, which is a losing proposition. But in that moment, you get to see, all right, so this is his father's story. This is his, experience, and perhaps his inability to function in the world the way he would like to, but can't because of the, segregation, what else is going on in the world. So he wants his son to be better than him, but it doesn't really come across that way. It's just like beating him down on his spirit. And then you see his son do the same thing. And in my mind, the other chapter, maybe you get to see another layer of how these men begin to develop as a result of the black women who sort of done this work in terms of redemption, in terms of healing. So maybe that, in some alternate universe, there's this other part of The Color Purple where you get to see how these men have benefited from the work that these women have been doing throughout the film. Because, I think you...
Yeah, in the film, one scene that when you're talking that stood out to me is when he's at the juke joint and he's drunk and he's dancing with Harpo and he tries to kiss him on the cheek and Harpo's like, whoa, wait, what you trying to do? Shows that idea of vulnerability that you're talking about, right? The need that you have to be out of your mind, drunk, to show happiness, to show that you actually care and love your son. Was very telling. Was a very telling scene. Again, those subtle drops of, cultural critique and analysis, right? The idea that black men, particularly rural Southern black men, can't demonstrate what that means. And I think about my own grandfather, who was the sweetest man in the world, right? Like, I mean, like he was this, he was always very supportive, telling me to do da-da-da-da. He always wanted a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and just that kind of affection that I really wasn't lacking. But hearing stories about him and his father coming up, that was a totally different story, right? I mean, like going back to Alice Walker, when we think about the third life of Grange Copeland, it's a similar conversation. It doesn't just happen in The Color Purple. When you think about Grange Copeland and his relationship with his granddaughter, like that is like the epitome of love and affection that he didn't show Brownfield. And like, what is that, as the older folks say, keep living, right? And what does that mean in terms of how we articulate what these emotions mean for us as they develop? It's something that, Alice Walker doesn't just do in The Color Purple. I mean, it's most visible in The Color Purple, but it happens in a lot of her other work, whether it's, everyday use, which everyday and Third Life of Grange Copeland, and you're having these complex conversations. So at the same time, I don't necessarily think that Walker was looking at this one-dimensional representation of black men. I think that she was building layers of the complexities of black men in very similar ways as Toni Morrison does in her novels and in Beloved, for example, with Paul D. They're in conversation. I think, like I said earlier, it's just a scapegoat to dismiss the fact that black men are presented in this particular light, because there are black men who do these types of things. There are abusive black men.
That's real talk.
But there's also the possibility of redemption and resurrection, which again goes to The Color Purple, which is why you see purple on Resurrection Sunday. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that it's all interconnected, and to not be able to or refuse to dig deeper into what that means is problematic.
Absolutely. So I have one last question for you. I've been thinking about this. So let's say you had the opportunity to curate a scene. So you got an audience of people, students. What scene would you choose, and what would you want them to walk away with in this particular scene that you're curating?
I got scenes because I love the color purple. That's just not fair.
Okay, we'll say two. We'll say two scenes.
Okay, give me two. The end scene will definitely be one. When I was talking about Mr. in the background, the sunset, they're doing the clapping dance, right? This idea of generational love and triumph and strength would be one of the things. Resurrection, right? And also the idea that it's cyclical. The South is cyclical. You're going right back to the beginning. Definitely the end scene of the film would be one. I love the juke joint scene with Miss Sophia and Squeak.
Yeah.
I just think it's, I mean, like, you know, that was a moment where you recognize not just Squeak. Now, you know, Squeak didn't just recognize because she got the mess knocked out of her, right? But when you like the men folk, like, you know, I think it was Lawrence Fishburne's character who was like, "Oh, it's time to go."
Yep.
Right?
Close up his piano.
Like the idea that there is a palpable Black woman's rage in what that looks like and how that's strung through the rest of the film. Because I would have to do three. I'm sorry. And then when Miss Sophia confronts Miss Melly, oh my God, I love that.
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately, you know, not only are you facing the dismissal by white women, right? You're and the idea or the stereotypical idea that Black folks don't take care of their children. Because I think she said, "Oh, you're so clean" or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Wait, what?" And her being like, "You want to be my man?" And she was like, "Hell no."
Yeah, no polite, just real. Nah, what the hell?
She was like, "What you say?" I said, "Hell no." I think it was a really powerful moment of Black women's protest. It was great. And then like what the retaliation for that was also kind of jarring also. I mean, like they literally knocked her out and her dress was going everywhere. And, you know, I mean, it was just like the exposure. You're talking about vulnerability. That's the ultimate vulnerability. You get knocked out and people are just looking at you laying there and you're taking, and your kids see you being, you know, it was just, yeah, those are my three. Those are the three that we would have to have conversation about.
Okay. Those are three powerful ones. I think I would go to that particular event to you know, unpack those scenes. So I want to thank you again for participating in Purple Points. And where can people follow you on Twitter? What's your Twitter handle?
At Red Clay Scholar all together, or you can hit me up at www.redclayscholar.com.
All right. So be on the lookout for amazing things, continued amazing things from the Red Clay Scholar. And I neglected to mention, I don't know how I left this out, the recipient of the Nasir Jones Fellowship for 2015, right?
2016, yeah, I'll be there in
2016. Okay.
Yeah, shout out to the Son and Bettina Love also. They got it too, so it's great.
Yes, nice. Shout out to all of them who are doing some amazing work. Support their work. And if you know somebody who should know their work, tell them. So in the words of the Red Clay Scholar, we all we got. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
All right. Peace.
Holla.